Hey everyone, welcome to Storyteller Shukai. This is episode 2 of the Great Qin Empire, the origins of the Qin people. The early history of the Qin state is incredibly scarce. Qin only rose to prominence during the spring and autumn and warring states periods. Before the era of Qin Mu Gong, one of the 5 hegemons of the spring and autumn period, there was barely any recorded history about Qin. Why? Because the Qin state had little interaction with the Central Plains states, the heart of Chinese civilization at the time. This means Qin not only has a lack of direct historical records, but also very few indirect mentions in the writings of others. Chinese culture often emphasizes circles, social and political groups that define insiders and outsiders. In our society, being in the circle means everything. Sometimes people spend their entire lives just trying to gain recognition as an insider. The Qin state in its early years was a marginal player, an outsider among the feudal states of the Zhou dynasty. If not for Qin Shi Huang, we might barely talk about Qin at all today. It was always on the fringe, always outside the circle. And since ancient historians prioritized recording the affairs of the Central Plains states, the inner circle of Zhou feudal lords, Qin's history was largely ignored. Qin's early history was incredibly challenging. Even today, we can't establish a complete lineage of Qin rulers. The list of their kings is significantly shorter compared to other states, about a third of the length. According to the records we do have, some Qin rulers appear to have been remarkably long-lived. But here's the twist. Most of the named rulers had extremely short reigns, often lasting no more than 2 or 3 years. Why? Because Qin was a fiercely warlike tribe. Their entire existence revolved around fighting. They were constantly at war, and most of their rulers, those whose names survive in history, didn't live longer than 5 years on the throne. That's why when people talk about the Qin state, they almost always center the story around Qin Shi Huang. Discussions of Qin's early history are usually brief and vague, not because historians weren't interested, but because they simply didn't have enough information. The further back you go in Qin's history, the more it's based on speculation, rather than solid evidence. Even today, we can't say for sure who succeeded whom in Qin's earliest dynasties. We can't even draw clear connections between Qin's timeline and what was happening in the Central Plains at the same time. But we can piece together a rough idea of the migration and activity of the Qin tribe from various ancient texts. Now, when we talk about Qin, people often associate them with Shaanxi, the land of Guangzhong. Even in the Han Dynasty, the area was called the Three Qin Territories. But here's a surprising fact. The ancestors of the Qin people were originally from Henan, not Shaanxi. The Qin tribe started as part of the Central Plains culture, and only later migrated to Shaanxi during the spring and autumn period. In fact, during the Shang Dynasty, the Qin were insiders. They were part of the circle. It wasn't until the Zhou Dynasty that they became outsiders. How do we view ancient histories, especially those that mix historical events with myths and legends? This isn't about someone making things up. It's simply how ancient people saw the world. There's no need to mock the people of the past. The history we write today, even just a few decades later, might seem laughable to people in the future. We all have limitations based on our worldview. What we think of as enlightenment today could be considered foolish tomorrow. Each era has its own particular type of ignorance. Ancient people believed in gods and spirits, so naturally their writings were filled with these supernatural elements. Does that seem strange? It shouldn't. They weren't trying to deceive anyone. They just genuinely believed in these things. So when we take the supernatural out of history, I think we're making a mistake. It's a form of ignorance. If you remove the gods, early history has little left to explain. What we really need is to reinterpret these stories with gods and spirits in them. The gods might not exist, but the things they were used to explain definitely do. Take Shiji, Records of the Grand Historian, as an example, specifically the Qin Benji, Annals of Qin. It starts with a ghost story, beginning with a legendary figure. The very first sentence says that the ancestors of the Qin people were descendants of Emperor Xuan Shu. Now, Zhuan Shu is a mythical figure, part of folk traditions. Was there really someone named Zhuan Shu in history? Was there even a tribe called Zhuan Shu? Or was he just completely made up? There's no way to prove any of that. Sima Qian, the author of Shiji, says that the Qin people's ancestors were Zhuan Shu's descendants. The question is, how do we understand that first sentence about the Qin people's history? If you look at it from a different perspective, this could simply mean that the Qin people were originally from the Central Plains, specifically from Henan. Why? Because if you trace all the places mentioned in the myth of Zhuan Shu and plot them on a map, you'll find that they're all in Henan province, right in the heart of the Central Plains. So whether Zhuan Shu was a real person or just a myth doesn't really matter. What matters is that the myth places the origin of the Qin people in Henan. In this way, myths can actually help us understand history. For example, Zhuan Shu represents the concept of Henan. When we say the Qin people are descendants of Zhuan Shu, what it really means in modern terms is that the Qin people's ancestral roots are in Henan, and they originally came from the heart of the Central Plains. The second sentence of the Shiji talks about a girl from the family of Zhuan Shu, named E02. One day, a dark bird called a zuan niao in Chinese, which means a blackbird, dropped an egg. The egg landed right in E02's hands. Now E02, being quite bold, ate the egg. After eating it, she found herself pregnant, and later gave birth to a child. Sounds pretty unbelievable, right? It might seem like E02 was just trying to come up with a story to explain to her father why she was pregnant without being married. But how could she possibly hide the fact that she was having a child? I mean, come on. Her dad must have known something was up. Eating an egg and getting pregnant? That's something only a young girl with a wild imagination would come up with. What father would believe that? But actually, this sentence holds a lot of meaning. In ancient history, stories like this, both in China and around the world, are not that uncommon. If you look at history closely, you'll notice that there was a period, or rather, a phase in human history, where a lot of these kinds of stories popped up. Just look at Greek mythology. There are many different ways heroes are born. Why is that? Well, here's my own take on it. Humans likely evolved from matrilineal societies, where lineage was traced through the mother, before gradually transitioning into patrilineal societies, where lineage passed through the father. Now, what difference does this transition make to us today? For most of us, it probably doesn't matter who leads a group or a society, whether the ruler is a man or a woman. But here's the real question. Who determines your place in your family or clan? Are you a noble or a commoner? Is it because of who your father is, or because of who your mother is? That's something we're very sensitive to. In a patrilineal society, you're a noble because your father was a noble. But in a matrilineal society, you're a noble because your mother was one. So, in a patrilineal society, not knowing who your father is can be very awkward. Can you understand that kind of discomfort? In matrilineal societies, a child would only need to know who their mother is, and it wouldn't matter who their father was. But in patrilineal societies, many of the old stories from matrilineal times became awkward. We're used to saying, "Who is your father?" and "Who is your son?" But back then, people would say, "Who is your mother?" and "Who is your daughter?" Stories about children not knowing who their fathers were started to become more common. This caused a real problem for storytellers in patrilineal societies, because it didn't fit the usual narrative. How can you tell a story of inheritance if the child doesn't have a father? So, in order to fit the pattern of a father-centered society, these ancient stories had to be twisted. This led to all sorts of strange stories, like the ones about getting pregnant after eating an egg or stepping in footprints. At that time, people believed in gods, so these myths used gods to explain the impossible. The second sentence of Shiji doesn't just try to explain why the children in a matrilineal society need to find a father. It also explains something else. Why the Qin adopted the sacred bird as their totem. One of the ancient totems passed down through history is the sacred bird, The sacred bird was actually the totem of the Qin people. Their flags and even their tattoos were based on the image of the sacred bird. Sima Qian explains why the Qin people liked this sacred bird, because they believed it represented their ancestors. In reality, this was a form of nature worship. The bird symbolized freedom and the desire to soar high, proudly looking up to the sky. There's another big issue here, though. We might not be as sensitive to colors today, but in ancient times, colors were a major political issue. Even the color of a dynasty's flag could be a matter of life and death. People in ancient times were very sensitive to colors, and I'll explain more about this later. For example, the Qin people were originally nobles during the Shang dynasty, but by the time the Zhou dynasty came around, they had become commoners. The Shang used white as their symbol, while the Zhou used black. The Qin people had a paradoxical situation. On the one hand, they prided themselves on adopting black as their color, aligning with the Zhou as staunch defenders of the Zhou system. On the other hand, they secretly worshipped the white emperor, making white a form of religious reverence. This was a kind of black skin, white heart situation. When Sima Qian talks about the story of eating the blackbird's egg and getting pregnant, it's not just a simple tale. There's a deeper meaning here. This story sets up a contrast for later discussions about the Qin people's worship of the white emperor. What Sima Qian is suggesting in this story is that on the surface, the Qin people appear one way, but deep down, they are different. This duality, this contradiction, is a key theme. Why did they live such complicated, conflicting lives? You'll understand better as we move forward, and I'll explain more later. So, when you come across this part in Shiji about eating the blackbird's egg, what you need to understand is the deeper meaning Sima Qian was trying to convey. Sima Qian's words may not be scientifically accurate, but they represent a perspective shaped by the worldview of people from his time. Don't dismiss his words just because they don't align with modern science. What we should do today is use our scientific knowledge to interpret the deeper truths behind these superstitions, not to belittle the wisdom of the ancients. The third sentence of Shiji says that the child born from E02 was named Daye. Daye later married the daughter of Shaodian and had a son named Dafei. Now remember, Dafei is the son-in-law of Shaodian. Dafei is considered the ancestor of the Qin people, which means the Qin are descendants of Dafei, and Dafei is Shaodian's son-in-law. And here we come to a new figure, Shaodian. Who exactly is Shaodian? Let me give you a bit of background. Sima Qian mentions the relationship between the Qin people and Shaodian. What's his point here? The goal is to link the Qin people with us, to bring them into our circle. We don't know how many children Shaodian had, but his eldest son was Yandi, the Flame Emperor, and his second son was Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor. In Chinese culture, we often call ourselves descendants of Yan and Huang. Shaodian is the common ancestor of both Yan and Huang. So the Qin people, being the descendants of Dafei, who is Shaodian's son-in-law, are not outsiders to the Yan-Huang lineage. They are part of the same family. The Qin people are like the Yan and Huang's nephews by marriage. In other words, the Qin people are relatives, not strangers. Now, if we put the first three sentences of Shiji into more modern scientific language, it would sound something like this. The Qin people's ancestors were part of a tribe living in Henan, starting from the time of Zhuan Shu. They adopted the culture of Yan and Huang, transitioning from a matrilineal society to a patrilineal one. Through a marriage alliance with Shaodian, they established a blood relationship with the Yan-Huang clan. Does that make it easier to understand? It's no longer just a ghost story. Do you think the people of the Han Dynasty would have understood my explanation? What they would have understood is this. The Qin people were descendants of Zhuan Shu, and the story about eating the blackbird's egg and getting pregnant was symbolic. Later, the Qin ancestor, Dafei, was Shaodian's son-in-law. That means the Qin people weren't outsiders. They were part of the same family. In the Han Dynasty, the Qin people were absolutely not pushed aside. After all, the Qin helped establish the Han Dynasty. So it was essential in the Han period to bring the Qin people into our circle. This was a key narrative. The Qin were the cornerstone of the Han dynasty's stability. In those first 3 sentences of Shiji, Sima Qian conveyed 2 main things. First, the Qin people are from Henan. Second, they are part of our inner circle, our own people. He also leaves a hint about the Qin's love for black. They adopted black as a core symbol, using the black bird as their totem, symbolizing their longing for the sky. Let's continue with a topic that sparked some debate during the Republic of China period: the origins of the Qin people. The question was whether the Qin people came from the Central Plains and migrated westward, or whether they came from abroad, moving eastward into China. Why was there such a debate? To understand this, we need to talk about a Swedish scholar named Johan Gunnar Andersson. He was a key figure in the archaeological field in China and represented the Chinese government in conducting archaeological excavations. Andersson led excavations for a long time, and the sites we now know, like the Yangshao site and the Peking Man site in Zhoukoudian, are directly related to his work. But the problem with Andersson's research is this. From his perspective, he believed that Chinese culture had originated from the West and then spread to China. During the Republic of China, this idea that Chinese culture came from the West was quite popular and even became a mainstream theory. If you read the history written by people from that time, you'll see this bias reflected. The idea that the Qin people came from the West originated with Andersson's archaeological discoveries. His entire theory was based on the evidence he found. In Gansu and Shaanxi, Andersson unearthed many Qin tombs, and he noticed something unusual. The tombs of the Qin people were different from the tombs of the other 6 states in the Central Plains at that time. The tombs in the Central Plains had bodies lying on their backs, arms and legs stretched out. But the Qin tombs featured what's called flexed leg burials, where the bodies had their legs bent, and some of the burials even resembled the mummies of the Maya people. In fact, this type of burial resembled the way babies are positioned when they are born. This was tied to the Qin people's beliefs. They believed in the cycle of life and death, so when someone died, they would bury them in the fetal position, symbolizing a return to their original state of being. This kind of burial was rare in the Central Plains, but was much more common in the Northwest. The key thing is that around 3,000 to 3,500 years ago, this burial practice was found in Central Asia. Andersson focused on this phenomenon because, from his perspective, it was evidence that Qin culture had strong connections to Western, particularly Central Asian cultures. He saw this as proof that Chinese culture, specifically Qin culture, had deep roots in the West. According to him, there was an unbreakable link between the Northwest cultures of China and the distant cultures of Central Asia. He argued that Chinese culture originated in the West. At that time, there were 2 completely opposing camps. One side argued that the Qin people came from the West, while the other side argued that the Qin people had simply migrated westward from the Central Plains. This disagreement was more than just a matter of geography. It was about where Qin culture truly originated. Was it from the people of Henan or from the people of Central Asia? My point of view is this: culture doesn't have a clear lineage. No culture exists in isolation, completely untouched by other cultures. So when we talk about the inclusive nature of Chinese culture, it's a slow, gradual evolution, one that has changed significantly over time. You could even say it's completely different from what it was originally. Cultures are made up of mutual influence. It's all about who leads the development, but it's always about learning from the good aspects. The real issue in cultural debates is that they're often political, not academic. The divisions we see are caused by politics, not by scholarly research. But this political divide affects the stance of scholars. The answer to this issue could actually be really simple. The Qin people were originally from Henan, but when they migrated westward, they adapted to the environment of the Northwest. Yet, deep down, they always carried a dream of returning east. This dream, combined with the strength of the Northwest people they'd integrated with, helped them ultimately return to the Central Plains and lead it. Isn't that explanation pretty straightforward? If you were to ask Emperor Qin Shi Huang, did your people come from the west or migrate from the east? I think he'd point to the great unstoppable force of steel marching forward and say, does it really matter? What matters is not the honor of our ancestors, but the pride of future generations in me. This is the central theme of cultural integration. Well, that's all for today's story. I'll also share a personal thought. Don't forget to subscribe and follow. See you in the next episode.